So just a few things I wanted to say as a sort of starting point. We are obviously looking at the largest population movement since the Second World War. And we are now beginning to see the need to have a new business model, if you will, to tackle this kind of a massive and protracted population displacement. This has been reflected, for example, in discussions in the context of the World Humanitarian Summit preparation process. The synthesis report for that summit has included references to a refugee hosting deal, which essentially talks about a need to have a new business model, which is not the current model where the refugees and displaced people are looked after by humanitarian agencies through, if you will, humanitarian assistance, and they stay displaced, dependent on humanitarian assistance for years to come. That model is no longer, many people feel, no longer sustainable, and that we need to move to a new approach where we have much more integrated approach between the humanitarians and the development organizations, involving some policy and legal actions by host countries, with additional incentive measures brought in by the international community, which will enable host governments to take such measures. Development organizations to address some of the structural pressures that are brought as a result of those countries hosting such a massive number of refugee and displaced populations. Some of you might have also read, or probably you have read, some interesting studies and op-ed pieces coming out in recent months. About a month ago, Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank, issued, I think it was in Washington Post, an op-ed piece, which had a very interesting title. If you want a global growth strategy, support refugees. Just a few days ago, I also read, I think it's the European Commission that issued a study that essentially says that accepting refugees will have, in the short run, some increased expenditure, obviously, to receive those number of refugees. But in the long run, those people who are coming into those asylum countries will have a massive positive impact on the economy of those countries, including on economic growth, but also in terms of more sustainable fiscal sustainability, even creating additional employment opportunities in the long run as a result of economic growth. So I think we are now beginning to discuss new perspectives. We need to shift. We feel that we need to shift our attention towards a little bit of a new dimensions or perspectives with regard to this refugee crisis. So that's what I wanted to, I'm not a development expert. I came from peacekeeping and humanitarian background. I'm new in development. But it will be interesting to actually look at some of the positive impact of these population movements overall. So that was my contribution, and over to you, Amir.
Thanks, Azumi. Good to have you with us here, and good work again together. I think the whole issue, and I agree fully with Azumi, the whole issue of development and humanitarian joint efforts dropped off the map many years back. There was a talk about the continuum from humanitarian to development, and that was refuted by many, that humanitarianism and development action have to work hand in hand from the beginning and the outset of any operation. And I think by embarking on a regional refugee and humanitarian and resilience response through the 3RP was a good start, although it came 2 years later. Since the beginning of the crisis, but I think it's proving to be a very efficient medium to really bring, and that's why we're here, development, resilience, and humanitarian together. and try to look at this crisis from an end-to-end perspective. And not only that, but to be replicated in other parts of the world to keep the momentum and learn from it and enrich the experience. Today the world is different, really, and one cannot compare it to any other moment of history. 237 million migrants in the world, 21 million refugees, another 38, 39 million internally displaced, 60 million. That's a number we haven't seen since World War II. The massive number of people moving. Today, if the camera goes back on the Western Balkans, you see people still in the thousands moving on a daily basis. And there are triggers for that. I think the number one trigger is the fact that the war in Syria continued for so long. It's a protracted situation, and the population, basically those who are in Syria or in the surrounding countries, lost hope of returning home. A population that prized education, with high value in education, like the Syrian communities. They saw that the children are out of school for 5 years now, be it in Syria or be it in the surrounding countries. The fact that humanitarian aid and international aid diminished, food, cash for shelter, and other type of assistance, all of these are triggers making these people move further. However, and I second Zumi and the President of the World Bank, the refugees and migrants, especially if migration is regularized through regular means and venues, they're an asset to any communities. There are many, if we look back at history, the last 200 years, many countries, new ones, the new world, that were made up of migrants and refugees. And now there is a whole set of skills that, as people enter Germany or Sweden, we just talk about our crisis today, I think by matching those skills to gaps and needs, these countries will definitely benefit. There is another way, aside from regular migration channels. Resettlement is a big way that UNHCR try to, with recipient countries, to resettle thousands of people in different parts of the world according to specific criteria and protocol. There's temporary admission. There are visas that are on a humanitarian basis. There are visas for admission, for scholarship or education. There are family unification, but all of those, although small, they make a big difference. Every family counts, and we're looking at the next 5 years to have maybe up to 400,000 that will be resettled in a structured and meaningful manner. I think the big boost that countries will receive from refugees and migrants is not to be underestimated, and the development, resilient, humanitarian joint action, I think is a formula that is that proves to be worth pursuing, and we look forward to this panel discussion and different aspects of this phenomenon that we're facing now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amin. So our first speaker is Dr. Erica Harper, who's the Executive Director of West Asia and North Africa Institute. She is going to speak from the podium there. The question that we wanted her to consider are the following. Obviously, this massive crisis in Syria, we need to do more within Syria, but we obviously need to do more in neighbouring host countries, including this particular host country in Jordan. But not only at the national level, but also at the local level. There was a session earlier this afternoon, and I was part of that, which was discussing the need to work and support the municipalities as well. So how could we jointly work to strengthen resilience of the displaced, that is the IDPs in the context of Syria, but also refugees in the refugee hosting countries. So resilience of the displaced people, but also resilience of host communities in the countries where they are hosted, in order for us to be able to address some of the structural issues that are related to hosting a refugee population. One of the win-win policy options for host countries, potentially they could, in fact, maximize the development gains or benefits associated with a refugee presence, as we have touched on in our opening remarks.
Thank you to both the co-hosts, UNDP and UNHCR. I'm going to be answering this question by talking about some research we've been conducting on post-state macroeconomics in the context of donor fatigue. Because I've got to condense a year's work into a few minutes, I'm going to skip over Lebanon and Turkey, and I'm going to cut straight to what might be Jordan's economic utopia. And the best analogy, strangely, is probably Singapore. A small, resource-scarce state that's invested heavily in education to make the jump to become this high-tech, knowledge-exporting economy. Now, Jordan hasn't been able to make that Singapore leap, and there's a variety of complex reasons in play, but the end point is that it's trapped at middle-income status. Now, few countries have risen out of middle-income status without the presence of a strong manufacturing sector. And Jordan's been doing all the right things. It's strategically invested in free trade and economic zones. But the foreign investment hasn't come at the level needed to establish what's called a cluster. And here we've really got to understand the enormity of the challenges in play. Sectors tend to congregate geographically. It's called spatial economies of scale. And to establish a cluster is enormously expensive. So Jordan's got to offer really great terms and conditions. Now, the zones are great, but companies also look at market access, regional stability, natural resources, and in particular, a large low-cost labour force. And this one's probably the draw card. Jordan's investment in education means that the jobs that Jordanians aspire towards are not really the ones that large manufacturing attracts. So Jordan didn't have enough on its place. Since 2011, it's taken in hundreds of thousands of refugees. Now, donors have given a lot in support. We don't have good enough methodologies to test whether this support has covered the cost of actual hosting, but intelligent speculation is probably that it never covers the full bill. Now, this becomes problematic in protracted situations where donor fatigue sets in. And there is strong evidence that there are negative economic consequences associated with the refugee population, particularly in the informal labour market. And this was all very curious to us. The economics told us that Jordan would benefit from knowledge-intensive manufacturing. It needs a labour force to attract the necessary foreign investment. Jordan doesn't want to import this labour. The National Employment Strategy has clearly laid out a map to replace migrant with Jordanian labour. But we have this huge refugee population that's manifesting in these negative economic ways. So we joined forces with a professor at Oxford University, Paul Collier, to help us think out some of these issues. And what it boils down to is that Jordan establishing a manufacturing sector is going to be really difficult. It has to compete with Asia. So it needs something different. It needs something more. And the two things that Jordan has more of is this refugee population, and it also is offering stability in an increasingly unfriendly neighbourhood. So is this enough to overcome these issues that are currently dissuading investment? And the answer is possibly yes, if it can be perceived as a good enough profit opportunity. And we think that there are three types of investors that would be interested. Now, the first is those that see a market in the manufacture of safe kind of products that are manufactured by refugees, giving them a livelihood while they're sheltering from conflict. You can imagine the creative marketing that would hone in on consumers' complex feelings towards refugees, their desire to help, but not wanting to host them in the same rates as countries like Jordan. Companies forced to leave Syria, Benetton, Lafarge, Roche, Caterpillar, Sony, they all had massive operations in Syria and would like to go back. And the big one is companies looking to position themselves prior to a post-conflict reconstruction boom. Don't worry that there's no end in sight. That's not an issue. This kind of profit speculation is what these firms do really well. So the model would be large manufacturing with some ratio of Syrian Jordanian labour. Jordan doesn't have to host refugees forever for the economics to work. At the right time, these firms quickly and easily decant back into Syria, and they've got a trained workforce to go with them. But the hard work is done. Jordan's now established itself as a safe and profitable place to do business in the Middle East. Some form of working rights would be involved. That's the only way that this works. But that might not seem so bad when you look at exactly what there is to gain. And it will create white-collar jobs, and these are the jobs that Jordanians are certainly better prepped for. Donors and IFIs probably do have a role in making all of this work, and I think they will, because these donors and IFIs, they're interested in building regional stability and resilience, and Jordan's economic success is pivotal to that. Now, there's a lot of scholarship around this, and I'm going to try and really quickly summarise my thinking on it. The first thing is that internationalised conflict is largely a thing of the past. The conflicts that the 21st century is going to be remembered for are civil conflicts. They're going to affect poor states and, to a certain extent, middle-income states. And there's four really scary things about these types of conflicts. They recur at a really high rate, around 40%. There's evidence that's up around 47% for this region. They're costly. They last for around 7 years, and a really conservative estimate is $20 billion. They have global spillover effects. Disease, internationalised crime, terrorism are all positively associated with protracted civil conflict, and they spread. Conflict, contagion, it's an evidential phenomenon. It means if your neighbour is in conflict, you are statistically more likely to find yourself in one within a period of time. So what can a government do? People really don't like talking about statistics at this point because wars involve people and personalities. But we're not really all that good at keeping the peace. So I'm going to tell you a few things that the evidence tells us that we should be doing rather than what we are doing. And there's 6 things that make a risk of civil conflict more likely. The big one is that wealth matters. Low income, slow growth economies are really at greater risk of conflict. Other things that matter: natural resources dependence, religious and ethnic diversity, having a larger population of young men. Size, bigger is worse. And again, the big one, having a conflict. It makes you more likely to have another one. There's not a lot that can be done about these things except for the first one, incomes and growth, and I'm going to come back to that. But what it means is that the most effective way to guard against civil conflict today is maintaining a post-conflict peace. And we know a bit about how to do this as well. Type of polity and elections do matter. The evidence is very disturbing, and people from Western liberal democracies don't really like talking about it, so I'm not going to get into it. Peacekeeping works. Peacekeeping does have a positive effect. It's expensive, it's unpopular, but it does work. And again, wealth. The lower the income, the slower the economic recovery, the more likely it is that you're going to fall back into conflict. And when you take all this together and you control for common causality and reverse causality, what it means is that we should be prioritising post-conflict security support and strategies that raise economic growth. I know I'm out of time, but I'll go back to that initial question of if after all these things I said, will investors put their money in Jordan, and will donors and IFIs play a role? And I said yes. And this is my punchline. There's a very scary, ugly reality playing out in Europe at the moment, and when the hysteria dies down, it's probably going to become clear that the best way to support the situation is to help host countries better provide opportunities to the displaced. They're going to Europe because they don't have prospects and they don't have hope here. Now, I've heard some really disturbing things from donors recently, suggesting that Jordan's going to try to capitalise on this crisis to create itself a manufacturing industry. Of all the ridiculous things that I've heard about this idea, and I've heard a lot, this one's my favourite, because Jordan will capitalise. make no mistake, as will Lebanon, as will Turkey. But to capitalise, to take what might be its one opportunity to overcome this enormous challenge and build itself a viable, stable, profitable manufacturing sector, like that's not good. It's great, and it's great for everybody because it's going to demonstrably increase Jordan's resilience to conflict. I'll just do the risk factors again. Natural resources. Jordan doesn't have any, so it doesn't matter. Diversity and size. We can't do much about these. Young men in the population, I would be thinking seriously how to get them into jobs. And the big one as well, it's like let's raise strategies that promote higher incomes and growth. And the other reason why it's good for everyone is that something will eventually happen in Syria. And when it does, the risk of recurrence is so great that we need to take steps to minimise it. Now, jobs and incomes protect, but macroeconomic recovery normally takes about 2 to 3 years to kick in, and those first 3 years are the vulnerability years. So steps to incubate a post-conflict Syrian economy can and should start now. Vis-a-vis the cost of conflict, when you take into account recurrence and the 20 billion in contagion and all those factors, the price of better dealing with this crisis is a real bargain. Where the conversations should be at right now are how to heighten Jordan's resilience by supporting it to grow and develop sensible and strategic sectors and kick-starting this Syrian economy. That's what the evidence tells us is most likely going to work, and that's where the international community is probably going to save its money. Okay, I'm done. Thanks.
States, and she's also the chief technical advisor, Syria Crisis response. Annabella has a long experience working with Irish Aid, the World Bank, and in different parts of the world, I think. Solomon Islands, in Timor-Leste, Tanzania, and I think her experience and her also academic background will speak for themselves. She studied international economics from John Hopkins, and also studied advanced studies in international economics in Austria. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much, Amin. I was asked to respond to a question that was actually had 3 clear components. One was about what is the labor policy framework, how we can support refugees to work on this. So in this regard, I'm looking at it clearly from an ILO perspective, which is access to work for refugees and their contribution to the local economies, and this is really the key. Currently, looking at the region in particular, Lebanon and Jordan, we have 2 countries where we actually lack a clear refugee policy. However, what we do have is a fairly clear process or track for migrant workers. And these are 2 countries that really depend in their economies on migrant workers. So there's clearly a lack of coherence on this level where the governments would be called upon to change their frameworks. However, the reason why we are sitting here is we've all recognized that we need a change of paradigm. It doesn't work the way it is. We cannot continue with just humanitarian support and dislink refugee response to development aid, while the host countries, their economy is under threat and their stability as well, in particular if you look at Lebanon. So this paradigm change will mean that we have to focus on host communities, on the host countries, and see how their economies can best provide for refugees while they benefit themselves. Now, this is at the national level. Let us zoom a little bit in on the local level. Again, at the local level, we really need the refugees to contribute. How do they do it best? by them having incomes. They will spend their incomes locally. They are not like migrant workers who send it home through remittances. They spend their money locally, which means an increase in purchasing power, and that's quite important, in particular where you talk about communities where the economy has been hit hard through the crisis next door. Also, this opens up for a lot of opportunities at the local level that has been marginalized, in particular in Lebanon as well as in Jordan, where there have been a lack of attention at rural development, and municipalities haven't received a lot of support. So this is actually for us beneficial, and this is what Erica said. Will they capitalize? Well, I really do hope so, that they will, and they really should capitalize, both countries. Now, the second part of the question where I was asked is what are the opportunities in labor mobility, and what can we do to foster them? How can we bring the private sector in? So, generally speaking, there is we can talk about, do we need do we open existing schemes for refugees, or do we create new ones? My answer to this region is both. And again, that comes into, it's like, what we want to create is a win-win situation for the host countries and the refugees. At the moment, it pretty much looks like a lose-lose, to be very frank and honest here. So we need to turn this. Opening existing schemes would be, if we look at Lebanon, there is the migrant workers who are allowed to work in construction and agriculture. Open that for refugees, make it legal. At the moment, it is illegal. Any type of work is illegal for refugees who have a residency as a refugee. So that is one. That is an existing scheme, but that won't be enough. Because what we need is to, and we also need to be convincing to our host countries, and not just say like, open your labor markets, it'll benefit you. No, we need to really support them. And this is where purpose-made programs will come in. Obviously, one scheme would be what Erica talked about, the industrial zones in Jordan, and really working on integrating refugees and opening for Syrian businesses as well. Another one is what we are doing is called employment intensive investment programs, where you call for large-scale investment, medium to, at the very least, medium to large scale. Same with a longer time frame, where you work with the government on creating assets or improving the country's assets. That could be, again, in infrastructure for industrial zones, or like simply opening up rural roads to support farming communities, to have water catchment systems in areas that are typically prone to droughts, these types of things. Then another area where it's beneficial for the host communities is in both countries we are faced with a skills mismatch, and there is a lack of Jordanians or Lebanese providing these skills in certain industries. So if there's a proven case, one could work with the government to provide work permits for Syrian refugees who have these skills to fill in. At the same time, however, it is up on us to support the governments with skills development programs to make sure that they actually raise a workforce that can fill that in the long run to have a sustainable solution. So that's one area. The other area, and then again also links into what Erica said, is self-employment. Now the Refugee Convention calls upon self-employment as well. That's not the case really in the region. Turkey more so, but certainly not in a formal way in Lebanon or Jordan. But that would definitely be something where we can say we need to really tap into the entrepreneurialism that some Syrian refugees bring. In these millions that are there is great potential to do so. Lastly, the private sector. Now I'm going to leave the region a little bit just to give an example how we can really bring in the private sector in all of this, other than absorbing the refugees as workers. If you look at Germany, the German Industrial Association, the BDI, was very outspoken by calling the government upon shortening the time frame to allow refugees to work. The Austrians followed relatively quickly from the Germans. The reason is because they actually need the workers. In the Austrians, the argument was more like refugees are a burden. If you let them work and earn their own money, you don't need to support them as much, so it's less cost for the government. So in countries where we have a strong employers organizations, they will speak out. So one of the things that we could do in this region is actually work with the employers organizations to strengthen them and help them provide the arguments to their governments of why it would be beneficial and how they can integrate the labor force of the refugees. The last part of the question that I was asked has to do actually with skills transferability. The biggest barriers to it, I mean, there's obviously language barriers, less important so in here, cultural barriers, but the biggest one is actually recognition of skills, and there we're really facing a problem because that's not happening at the moment. So what we would need in particular for vocational training, this is as important for integrating them now as in the future when refugees would return to Syria, hopefully, that they would immediately be able to contribute to the rebuilding of their country. In order to do so, they need to have their skills recognized. Ways of doing it is mutual standards for testing, for example, or even recognizing certifications from the other country. Now, that's relatively difficult at the moment to reach this, but what we can do is work with the governments in actually this very the certification that we encourage training of refugees, vocational training, and certified by an authorized institution, so it is easier in the end to recognize these skills when they return to Syria in the end. I'm going to leave it. This was a quite wide range that I was asked to answer. I'm going to leave it at this.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist speaker is Mr. Michael Callan, who's the Director for Development from Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Government of Canada, who also has some background in working with the military, as well as some very important think tanks, Aga Khan Foundation and Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Moscow as well. Now, the question that we were asking him is the following, and this has been actually one of the biggest challenges that we've all faced here in this region, and that is that this crisis is affecting middle-income countries, which are large refugee-hosting countries, which obviously has some impact restrictions on development aid, etc. So the question is, are the usual humanitarian instruments and approaches, are these adapted to the specific situations, circumstances, and challenges of the middle-income countries? And how can the international community strengthen its support to those host countries that are Middle East countries in the region, in the spirit of, obviously, solidarity? After all, they are doing massive amount of support to the refugees. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you UNHCR and UNDP for hosting us here today. I'll try and be brief and try and keep to our 5 minutes here. And in doing so, I'll just outline 4 general points. So the question in general is asking whether the usual humanitarian instruments and approaches are well suited to the current context. And of course, that's a bit of a loaded question, because if they were, we probably wouldn't be here today to talk about it. So perhaps it's less a question about whether they are, and more of a question about what needs to be done to make them more appropriate to the local context. And primarily the local context being defined by taking place in middle-income countries, and certainly over the longer period of time, over a protracted time frame. Because we know that the traditional humanitarian instruments are terrific at setting up to responding to sudden onset crises, typically in cases where governments are completely overwhelmed. And it excels at that. What we also know is that it's perhaps a little less well adapted to middle-income countries, again, over the longer term. So what needs to be done to help it adapt? Let's start off with just one overarching point, and that's to focus more heavily on local institutions, systems, and structures. In middle-income country contexts, these structures are more capable than in other contexts, and it's often local government and non-government entities that are the first responders to crises. And in protracted scenarios, we know that these local systems, institutions, and structures will be relied on more heavily over the long term as well. So adapting to middle-income context means starting with what is and helping those systems and structures to become more capable and, of course, more resilient over the long term. And this is in contrast to setting up massively capable, but also expensive parallel systems that are typically enlisted to following a sudden onset crisis. Local institutions and structures, they're community associations, government structures, and other existing networks. Public schools, public clinics, local civil society groups, start with them and consider how can the humanitarian structure work through and with them. We know over practice that this is less expensive over time and crucially will leave capacity behind. So leaving capacity behind, we know that's a bit of a different frame of thought for traditional humanitarian approaches. It touches on the big S word of sustainability. And we know that that's not typically at the core of a humanitarian effort, and for good reasons, because humanitarian resources are limited and need to save lives in many places around the world. But considering the sustainability, or at least the enduring impact of our interventions, I think should be a core tenet when operating in middle-income countries that really offer us something. They offer us a strong base on which to build upon. So it's a question to ask ourselves, for everyone who's involved with international responses, if you had to close down the response that you're associated with today, what would be left behind? Working in middle-income countries on protracted crises, it suggests, demand that we ask this question of ourselves. And just a word to acknowledge the importance of humanitarian principles, because we know the crucial importance of maintaining independence and neutrality is just at the center of an effective and efficient and unbiased humanitarian response that addresses the needs of the most vulnerable. And certainly this first point isn't suggesting that all humanitarian assistance should or could go through local governments. But two ways to work through this. One is working through local institutions and systems that aren't necessarily government-oriented. And second, touches on a larger concept that I'd like to refer to, and that's basically opening the tent and introducing not just introducing, but enlisting development partners, new development partners, and new development funds as key actors in a resilience response. We know that development donors and IFIs can and should work to reinforce local government capacity at all levels possible, and perhaps in ways that humanitarian dollars and tools aren't necessarily set up to do. Ministries of Education, Municipal Affairs, Health, Water, Irrigation, and Planning all need international support in addressing the needs that will remain in their countries for some time. And often development tools and development funding are well suited to address those types of needs. And that's personally why I like the word resilience, because it goes beyond the words humanitarian and development, and it just recognizes what needs to be done by whoever is best placed to do it. A third principle, and almost done here, but a third principle, I'd just like to enlist your own energies here. Just a quick question. From the floor, who here believes that the effects of the Syria crisis will last beyond 1 year? It's maybe a show of hands. Who thinks it's going to last beyond 1 year time? Sure. And beyond 2 years' time? Beyond 3 years' time? Okay. So single-year programming in the face of this realization just no longer seems to make sense. It's needlessly expensive and disruptive, and yet still features as a prominent part of the response, I think on all sides, donors certainly included. So the third principle really is to extend the planning and funding horizon of the response. A longer-term planning and funding horizon also needs to consider the importance of maintaining the dignity of those most affected by the crisis. Right now, we're at year 5 of the crisis with many thousands of people who've had to rely exclusively on international and national aid. And how long can we expect those people to continue in such a scenario? Another 3 years, as we identified, another 4 years, more? And let's ask ourselves, what are the security costs of this loss of dignity? The political costs, the economic, and certainly the human costs. A longer-term planning horizon needs to identify paths to self-sufficiency and independence, well, self-sufficiency that is independent, or at least less dependent on aid. And fourth and finally, don't wait. This is a little trickier, but when thinking about how to adapt the humanitarian approach to crises in middle-income countries, we really shouldn't be waiting until the 5th year of the crisis. We know that, of course, some thinking has gone on, and important thinking at that. But the overall principles that we need to really be considering resilience, investing in local systems, extending the planning horizon, and focusing on dignity right from day one. So these 4 quick concepts doesn't mean to discount any of the important progress that's been made in adapting the humanitarian system to date. The use of cash and vouchers, building resilience into formal appeals, having dedicated resilience projects. The World Bank and other IFIs are starting to get more engaged, and these are critical and shouldn't be overlooked. But the 4 concepts I just mentioned, I do with the spirit of adding to the conversation. That's additional lines of effort that I believe should be redoubled as we struggle to adapt the humanitarian response and architecture to a more comprehensive, protracted crisis response.
Thanks, Mr. May I introduce the next speaker, and that is Mr. Luis Hoffman, head of Transition Recovery Division of Iowa, based in Geneva. Hoffman worked in transition recovery with the Department of Emergencies, focused on global issues, post-crisis recovery, and will share with us his views, and will pose a question to him, and that is, how can migrants and other displaced people take an active part in local development dynamics with benefits to their own communities as well as to the new host communities. And as Hoffman is taking the floor, I must say we have 50 minutes left, and we still have 3 speakers, so we limit our interventions to 5 minutes as per our original plan, so that we can finish in 15 minutes perhaps, and have a good half an hour for discussion with the colleagues on the outdoor cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Amin. And thanks to UNHCR and UNDP for hosting today. I'll give a quick few thoughts and see if I can keep it as short as possible. The Syria crisis has many dimensions, but perhaps none so impactful as the human mobility patterns that have been created now inside Syria, inside this region, as well as beyond this region. The numbers are well known. They're staggering, frankly. And what's more, displacement and mobility continue. This tells us a lot about resilience levels today for refugees and IDPs. Since the onset of the crisis in Syria and through all of these movements, the fortunes and the futures of host communities, migrants, and the displaced have all become inextricably linked. Host communities throughout this region continue to play an invaluable role in meeting acute needs, in providing protection, and in addressing vulnerabilities. But nearly 5 years of conflict in Syria, needs continue to outstrip capacities. And so we now have an increasing condition of vulnerability amongst host communities themselves, as well as amongst migrants and the displaced. This is one of the key warning signs that compel all of us today to be looking at new ways of improving coping mechanisms and reducing vulnerabilities. The message for the resilience-based development agenda is clear. We cannot move ahead without addressing the needs of both host communities and refugees and displaced. All stakeholders have a role in better realizing the resilience agenda, but none may be as important as the respective roles and the linkages between host community members and those moving as a result of conflict. The question put forward highlights the specific importance of working and investing with both the hosting as well as the migrant and displaced communities in the broader discussion on resilience building and local development action. The good news is that migrants and displaced can and do contribute to development. Globally, 1 in 7 people is on the move, and the vast majority of this movement is about meeting discrete labor market needs, expanding income opportunities, sending remittances home, integrating markets, and activating networks, diaspora networks, on multiple levels. Globally, these are important forces for development, and the same dynamics are true in this region. Migrants and the displaced can be buyers and even investors in these markets. They bring and they transfer skills, and they expand social and economic networks. These, again, are positive forces for change, and mobile populations are at the center. At the same time, given heightened vulnerabilities, local development efforts risk failure if not integrating all community members, migrant and displaced alike, into development plans and development action. Without this, the burden of acute humanitarian need and vulnerability will continue to outstrip resources at the local, national, and the international levels. If we succeed in a strategy that incorporates migrants and displaced into local development activities, we not only improve prospects for local development, but we begin investing back into communities of origin. If we can manage to engage migrants and displaced community members productively in local economies, in strengthened social networks, and in a collective effort to preserve the environment, this will reap benefits for the future of home communities. This is a way of investing in durable solutions by ensuring that there are capacities, skills, education, and current experience to be brought to bear on community recovery and future investments in areas of origin. The question also asked how we might do this. I'm going to offer 3 quick suggestions and close. First, in order to build resilience for everyone, current priorities must be focused on investing in support to host communities. Acute humanitarian needs will still need to be met, particularly amongst the newly displaced. But we should focus support on ensuring the continued capacity and the willingness of host communities to sustain all community members and ultimately to seek an agenda for growth. Investing across the board on infrastructure and services at the community level will directly benefit displaced populations and will also open opportunities for better enabling the displaced to cope and to recover. This builds resilience for everyone. Second, host communities must engage migrants and displaced populations in local development planning and action in order to realize the development potential of migrants and displaced and to ensure tangible development gains. Migrants and displaced populations bring positive force to markets and development. Host communities can and should engage migrant and displaced communities in local development as part of the future and as part of investing in conditions for eventual solutions to displacement in the region. Not only will this help build resilience today, But every vocation, education, or bit of training that is preserved in a migrant or a refugee or an IDP will be part of facilitating a solution to displacement in the future. These are the skills that they'll need to make a successful recovery and a transition to a post-conflict Syria. Given the tremendous burdens being shouldered by many of these communities, it will be increasingly difficult to realize development gains without an approach that integrates all community members. Lastly and quickly, from our own programming perspective, we need to constantly check how we assist and how we deliver. Promoting ownership and individual agency are central to building resilience and to development cooperation. But after almost 5 years of displacement, host community dynamics are complex and under strain. Exceptional measures are needed and required to ensure social cohesion is maintained. Support to resilience and development in a crisis context must be highly contextualized in a way that addresses the social cohesion agenda while it expands service and infrastructure capacity. Larger scale development programming must be tailored to ensure broad community engagement and participation as a central part of the resilience agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is also a colleague of mine. His name is Irina Vyakova-Solarno. Did I pronounce it right? Almost. She is resident coordinator and UNDP resident representative in Serbia, obviously one of the transit countries in the current crisis. Now, the question for her is the following. How can we, the actors at the local, national, and international levels, best respond to what we might call irregular migration movements that is mixed with massive number of refugees and asylum seekers? What are the sort of particular challenges in this complex movement of people, and on which aspects should efforts be concentrated?
Thank you so much. I have 5 minutes. The question was, how do we respond? Why do we have to respond? What happens when displaced people suddenly show up in a municipality? And if we have to respond, that means that from the municipality perspective and from the development perspective, we have, as Louis was saying, when sudden influx of migrants, displaced persons come, they disrupt the normal service delivery in a municipality. And that endangers development that has been achieved in this municipality. So the response is that first, we need to strengthen the capacities of the existing municipality to serve themselves so that they are strong enough to serve the incoming population. And this is a migration and development framework that we have been following. And we have been following this in Serbia, supporting municipalities that this very simple things like garbage collection. It sounds simple, but it became a big issue if you have 10,000 refugees coming through a municipality that actually has only 2,000 inhabitants. And so it is a matter of garbage collection, it's a matter of security, because such a municipality has only one policeman. It is a matter of providing water, providing health care. So the basic development services that the municipality provides are suddenly disrupted and put in question. So for UNDP, the focus in this is to address the impact of migration or displacement on municipalities. We have, in crisis situations, this is a sudden impact which needs an emergency response, but an emergency response with a development hat. And that's where the resilience comes from. We need to respond immediately, but with thinking long term. And you were being asked, how long do you think this will last? It will last years. That means that if we just respond with emergency response, we are actually not doing anybody a good service. We are just increasing the delivery for a few months and then we disappear. So we need to do it in a more resilient and forward-looking way, and naturally also with the municipality together. Just moving in and doing it for the municipality is not the answer. It has to be done with the municipality, which then in return actually motivates the economy. And this is also what we have seen in Serbia, that some of the small towns that have been affected suddenly had 5 bakeries before they had only 1. And these are small steps, but very important steps. So it is linking the displacement to local service delivery, but also to local economy, but doing it in a smart way and in a forward-looking way. That means with the municipality together. These are the examples that we have done in Serbia, but we have also municipalities within Syria where UNDP is helping the communities. And this is a help where we have to look at who can provide the services that normally were there but are disrupted because of the crisis. Because lack of hospitals, because lack of education, the schools are destroyed. How do we do that? So in crisis situations, looking for the right local partners who can actually step in and deliver this service until we get a normal situation back. These are things that we do and which we find extremely important. But equally important is also that we understand with whom are we dealing with. And depending on that, we have to also frame our services. Is this a temporary displacement? Is it a refugee situation where refugees are going to stay and will be integrated? Or is it a situation where people are leaving a municipality and the services are not being delivered because the service delivery is not possible anymore? So these are all different scenarios for which we always use the same terminology, but we have to learn to distinguish so that our services are really there where they are needed. In crisis situations, it has to be fast. In normal, stable situations, migration is a steady flow. And if it is well analyzed, especially on the municipality level, we can assist with service delivery and we can stabilize municipalities when migrants come or if they go. It's just we need to have a very solid analysis with the municipalities and with the people who are affected and not in conference room and libraries. Thank
you. Finally, let me introduce Carson Hansen, who is the Regional Director of NRC for the Middle East. Many of you know Carson, who worked extensively in this region, in Palestine, in Iraq, and now Syria, but also worked in West Africa and other places. He is dealing with an operation that we call end-to-end. And our question to him basically today is in the full framework of the 3RP as NRC is a partner and beyond. Lessons can be learned from the interface between humanitarian development, stakeholders in building the resilience of displaced persons, refugees, and host communities, and how could the stakeholders contribute to protection, including empowerment of refugees, including in areas like education, vocational training, and so on.
Thank you very much. As the last speaker, I hope you're still with us. Yes, indeed, a challenging situation. Now we're in the 5th year of this horrific crisis, and more than 4 million people have left Syria. And as the situation continues to deteriorate, there's no real perspective of an immediate and safe return for all these people. At the same time, the main refugee hosting countries, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, and Jordan, are all facing enormous economic and social challenges as consequences of the crisis. This entails a radical shift in our thinking. We now need commitments to provide stable and predictable funding and investment into building host countries' capacity to manage the displacement and its consequences. It also means supporting host countries to address legal and policy barriers that prevent refugees from building a dignified life where they can better support themselves and their families. So what does it mean? How do we do this? In the waiting for political solutions, it means that international donors and refugee hosting governments need to work together. Though we have, and we are, focusing a lot of education for primary school children, with good reasons, we also need to increase secondary, tertiary, and vocational education opportunities for youth in camps and host communities, to provide a safe space for youth to continue learning and be engaged in wider community development discussions. Scale up and expand higher education opportunities for Syrian youth in displacement. This could include relaxing restrictions on their ability to enter host countries' universities and at a national subsidized rate. Fundraising for scholarships programs for vulnerable host community and Syrian youth who can't afford these costs, and recognizing and accrediting distance learning opportunities. The resilience agenda should include and benefit all those affected by displacement, including refugees and vulnerable members of the host communities. Enabling refugees from Syria to reside in neighboring countries legally and the procedures for maintaining valid documentation and registration must be clear, accessible, and affordable. We must allow refugees from Syria to access basic services, including education, medical care, and housing, without compromising the quality of public services for host communities. This means significant new investment in national institutions and infrastructure to boost service delivery. Donors and host governments should work together to unlock the potential economic contributions that refugees can make to meet their basic needs, while also benefiting the countries where they temporarily reside. Supporting refugees to be more self-reliant through greater livelihood opportunities without negatively affecting the economies of host communities. Youth programs should be designed for holistic personal and community development through volunteering, youth-led initiatives, and other leadership opportunities in addition to training. Community-based programming, such as through community centers, should be provided to create bridges between host community and Syrian youth as a part of resilience programming. Vocational training opportunities for Syrian youth should be supported, as well as expanded opportunities for volunteering and mentor internships, including inside Syria. We should continue to engage in resilience approaches that support displaced youth and create a win-win opportunities also for host populations. We think that we need a new pact on aid. The international community shares responsibility for supporting refugees from Syria and addressing the challenges posed by hosting such large number of people. Covering the basic needs of refugees, expanding public services, and allowing refugees increased entry into the formal labor market are courageous policy choices that can build resilience for refugees and host countries. This requires immense and immediate investment from the world's healthiest countries in order to bring long-term positive outcomes. To conclude, if the international community is serious about addressing the Syrian crisis, immediate and continued efforts has to be exercised to put maximal political pressure on the influential stakeholders to end this horrific war. Whilst waiting for the war to stop, we need to ensure all efforts are mobilized and to ensure a dignified life for Syrian refugees and their hosting communities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are now going to open up and invite all of you to speak from the floor, commenting or asking questions. Hopefully we will have some interesting interactive sessions from now on. Yes, sir, in the front row. Do we have a microphone? And if you could identify yourself, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Abdussalam. Can you hear me? Abdussalam Sid Ahmed, Regional Representative, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Middle East. Thank you for all these interesting presentations from different people within their different mandates. I would like just to bring the human rights dimension, or if you like, discourse, to the Syria refugee crisis. I don't think it is absent from the people's minds, but it is something that we would like definitely as an agency that is concerned about this issue to put it forward. Obviously there are at the heart of the crisis itself, the human rights violations and the international humanitarian law violation. But what happens to the people when they go to the receiving countries? There are multiple issues of human rights concerns, starting with the human rights at the border itself or at the frontier, and then when people are in the respective countries, there are issues that has to do with access to justice. There are issues that has to do with discrimination, sometimes xenophobia, sometimes racism, both institutional and within the host communities. Despite we recognize definitely the generosity that has been displayed by the respective countries within the region itself. And then, of course, there are issues that are more complex, and I think the speakers alluded to some of them, that has to do with access to economic, social, and cultural rights. Definitely, right to work is an important aspect of them, and the problem in my view, I don't know to what extent people think that human rights discourse is not necessarily in harmony with the resilience agenda. I don't think there is a contradiction in that regard, but the worry is that some of the policies that has been either articulated openly or indirectly are going in the direction of making it as difficult as possible for the refugees so that they should leave somehow. And I think we all recognize that is happening in the countries of the region, and definitely it is also an issue that people, it shouldn't be, people should not come to Europe, etc. So the point we try to make within the human rights discourse is that the refugees, displaced people, they have rights. And as people, rights holders, they are not begging for mercy definitely from the receiving countries. The countries that receive the refugees also have obligations, whether they have signed to the Refugee Convention or not. They have signed to plenty of human rights conventions that would give them the duty to provide support and also to acknowledge the rights of these people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Those are very important aspects of this whole issue. Yes, over there. We'll take 3 or 4, I think, in one go, and then we'll invite panelists to.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shirley. I want to discussing about the Syria crisis. I think it's directly turn over the global crisis, and today we're discussing the international role of the international NGO and also role of the national NGO. And absolutely, the donors, 95%, they support international NGO to bring host community and the refugee together. Or, for example, they support the international NGO to livelihood program or access education program, access to the other different projects. And the main issue, the implement partner, in general, the national NGO. And the role of national NGO, when they apply the international donor system, they have an access. For example, in ECHO, national NGO couldn't apply any project in the ECHO, European Commission, and today European Commission discussing how we can support the refugee, but they are not let the national NGO to apply to their system. And UNHCR, for example, I have an example in Turkey, 95% of the budget directly going to international NGO, but 90% of the work doing by the national NGO. And the feed or other international NGO donors are the same. So if we are not supporting national NGO, because the national NGO is part of the host community. For example, if you carry out bring people together, who can do that? The national NGO can play a significant role on these issues. So conceptually, I think we have to discussing this system, and the donor system, not let the national NGO to play his role in this refugee crisis. And I think it's not like the other crises. If we are not let national NGO play his role, I think the million of the people will flatter the Europe, and then in the Europe we still have a problem between the host community and not a refugee. They are citizens of the European side, and still they have a problem between both sides. So, as cultural issue, access to the other programs, and also the language, and access to the bureaucracy and state. I think the national NGO has a significant role, and we ask the international donors, why you are not open your system for national NGO? If there is a system, we have to change this system. If we not change system, all the people will be suffer from this system. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Gentleman there, and then third and fourth. Over there.
Hi, my name is Robert Jaff. I am the country director of Qandil, Swedish organization based in Kurdistan region. Having grown up as a refugee myself multiple times and an IDP myself again, I very much sympathize with the problems that the refugees and IDPs go through. Until I was thankfully able to, have the opportunity to immigrate to Canada when I was 15 years old. So one problem that I see nowadays in international response to refugees and to IDP crises is that every time there's a new influx of refugees, the previous ones are forgotten somehow. They fall in the cracks, and the response often doesn't target all the populations. For example, in Kurdistan region, the situation of the refugees and IDPs has become so sensitive, specifically because the Kurdistan regional government initially was hosting refugees from Iran and Turkey, and now from Syria, and then the IDPs from the rest of Iraq. In addition to that, what the situation is really making it even more difficult is that the Kurdistan regional government itself is actually fighting ISIS, as well as hosting these large populations of displaced persons. How can we make international response to such crises more effective in a way that does not leave out any portion of the displaced persons? Often when funding arrives in a country, they say specifically this is for this group, whereas the previous groups, because they've been there for so long, they've just been forgotten. It doesn't mean they don't need these kinds of assistance. So how do we really implement a do no harm approach, not only toward between host communities and refugees, but also pre-existing IDPs and displaced persons? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the presentations were quite touching the actual heart of the matter. And I think I thank you all for that quality. But there is one thing that we don't touch upon, is probably it's not the actual aim of the present developmental discussions, but all migration issues, all people changing place to another place would involve two-sided interaction. One is migrants, immigrants, the other one is the host community or host society, basically the host society. I think, especially in the next step, it should be discussed in the light of these two agents, people coming to a new country, that you have discussed all of that, but no one has touched upon the receiving country, receiving society. We know that there is a great conflict and potential, very great potential for the future. Even in this country, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq, the language is the same, or more or less the same, religion is the same, and ethnic roots are the same, but yet there are conflicts. Go to Turkey, religion is in general the same, ethnic and other aspects of two communities or two sides are quite different, and we are experiencing quite a great difficulty, especially in the alongside of the border to Syria. And now there is another picture in Europe. There is no similarity culturally, language, and ethnic relations. In that sense, we are going to observe and probably live a new conflict, probably conflict harsher than any conflict in Europe now, because already they have been dealing with immigrant Turks who immigrated 50 years ago. Now they have another Islamic community in Europe, and they are going to fight probably against it. So it is a contribution, but I think this all these discussions should take into the conditions of the host societies, because the topic, the problem is a very interactive, very much dynamic problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Yes. Do you have the microphone over there? Yes.
Hello everyone, Koray Balke from Turkish Confederation of Employer Associations. First of all, I would like to congratulate all of the speakers. That was a really fruitful discussion. I just want to give support to ILO representative. Actually, if I was on the stage, I was going to say the same things what she mentioned. She was really right about the importance of the employer organizations in this process, because in Turkey we are facing with difficulties. Although we have a legislation on temporary protection, we don't have anything on working permits right now, and this issue is it's a huge issue for us, because we have more than 2 million registered Syrians in Turkey. And do you think none of them are working? Of course they are working, but in informal sectors, which damages the balance of the economy, and the competitiveness issue is a huge problem for us at this stage. As Turkish Confederation of Employer Associations, we conducted a survey between employers and their perception about Syrian refugees and their working permits, and we will be publishing it next month. But the first results are they're really supporting the working permit issue, because they need to engage, they need to enter the labor market. However, there should be a balance between the sectors, actually, because in some sectors we really need Syrians there, but in some sectors we already have overload by Turkish citizens. So that was the first case I want to mention. Second one is different than the other countries. Turkey has a language issue. In order to involve the Syrian refugees to Turkish labor market, language is a must. So we need to provide some language training for them before they enter. We expect them to be part of the Turkish labor market. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're going to cut once and then invite our panelists to respond to some of those issues. I wrote down a couple of the issues that I am myself quite interested in, but would you like to respond first?
Thank you. I think these are very important. Actually, some of them are opinions rather than questions. Some of them are questions. I picked up on a couple of them where I see a theme across the board. One is the issue that was raised by the colleague Abdeslam from the Office of High Commission on Human Rights, and the issue of access and the benefits that refugees are entitled to and what they're getting, given whether they're part of the 1951 Convention or not, since they're party to many of the other human rights. I think we in this, for the Syria situation, we face a very unique situation where 4.2 million registered refugees are given asylum. We haven't seen cases of refoulement. We haven't seen cases of eviction and deportation. I think against all odds, I would say neighboring countries in time of crisis and war in the neighboring country, they open their borders and allow 4.2 million people to come. We understand if we ask, for example, the Jordanian or the Lebanese or the Turkish government, there are more, even the Egyptian government, there are more people in their countries than what is registered. So we're talking about 5 million plus, and I think our demarches with these countries continue to center around the rights for refugees, be it access to services, be it access to territory, be it freedom of movement, employment. And it's true, in many cases, refugees do work, although there is no legal framework for them to do so. I know of one country that's moving toward that, and that's Turkey, where refugees still work. What he just added, the constraint they face as far as language, communication, how they integrate the sectors that are needed. Where in Europe, I see that, for example, look at Sweden. There was a mapping of the refugees and asylum seekers that are arriving in Sweden, and they're being directed to different disabilities in Sweden in a kind of an orderly manner. Although this is a new arrival compared to the ones that are in the immediate region. I think, given all that, an imbalance, I see an exemplary asylum phenomenon happening in the region, and solidarity with the Syrian people, by the government or by the communities themselves that did not have an outbreak of xenophobia. We did not have fights in the streets or neighborhoods. We did not see gunfire. We have not seen people driven out in trucks by the thousands. We have not seen deportation, and so far they do live and exist side by side. Doesn't mean the marches to bring the level of protection and assistance and rights to refugees should stop it. A lot have to be done, but also a lot of, I would say, solidarity, burden sharing, and support from the international community at large for these countries to really continue keep Syrian refugees in the bellies of their towns and villages continue. Local NGOs, we do work with national NGOs. It's true that in Turkey the balance is perhaps not there, but this is one of the areas that we have always been demarching the government for. Part of it also, I think, that at some point that the environment for national NGOs in Turkey, we see that needs to improve so that international organizations like UNRWA need to engage with them in a more predictable manner and be given be empowered and given access to really work throughout the country and with us in partnership, especially in the case of the Syrian refugees, because this is one of the biggest challenges facing the country, the government of Turkey and the people of Turkey right now. I think I'll resume to those questions and leave the others to ask.
Anyone on the panel who would like to respond?
Maybe just quickly carrying on your response about the question about international NGOs versus local NGOs, because it's one we consider quite dear to heart. And you can understand that meeting certain financial management and tracking and reporting systems can be difficult for some NGOs that might not be able to navigate the full labyrinth of complicated donor funding requirements. And if the crisis response was going to take place over a year or two, you might be able to forgive some of the international donors and international NGOs for not investing that time to address that issue, address the capacity of financial management issues. I think that's the opportunity that lies within a resilience approach, where it recognizes that the effects of the crisis will remain with us for some time now. And there is no longer an excuse to avoid that question. We know that in the long term, it's more cost effective, and it's more appropriate to have as local responses as possible, and that's often through local NGOs. So I think it is a bit of a, let's use the momentum behind the resilience agenda to really shake ourselves up and acknowledge that it's not okay just to deliver. We need to build capacity. And that certainly applies for different ends of the spectrum. It applies to local national NGOs, but also to host government capability, just capacities in general. We've heard, for example, putting support on budget is difficult in many circumstances because the financial management capacity might not be there as well. But the same principle applies. We know this is going to be a long-term process. We know we can't afford it in the current model. We know it's more cost-effective to deliver through local systems, institutions, and structures, be they local NGOs or host governments themselves. So let's use resilience to encourage each other to invest, to address whatever perceived or real capacity gaps exist, to allow funding to flow more directly to local NGOs and governments.
Thank you. Just on this very quick response from my end, this is one of the key issues that are being discussed in the context of the World Humanitarian Summit. They call it localized approach. I think this will be, hopefully, this will be one of the commitments that will come out of the Istanbul Summit. And then here, I think one of the important key element is for the international NGOs to also start shifting their roles and responsibilities and approaches, and that they they work with local and national NGOs, and then so that the donor communities can also change their regulations, etc., requirements. But this is definitely one of the key deliverables, hopefully, from the Istanbul Summit. I wanted to also respond to your issue, for example, in Kurdistan. Absolutely, I think one of the key principles of spirit of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, is no one left behind. And so as such, we cannot leave the old caseloads from the past. But here I really want to actually bring one issue that no one has so far mentioned here, and that is also the responsibility of the political actors. Between the humanitarian and development actors, no matter how well we work together, build resilience, etc., we would not be in the end ultimately produce the solutions. There will have to be a political solution. I was in Kurdistan whenever it was, 1991. And we are still looking at, in different contexts, of course, those humanitarian issues. And the reason is that there has not been a sustainable political solution. So we need to bring in the political actors. The relationship will have to become a triangular cooperation, not just between humanitarian and development, but also peace building and political actors will have to come into this equation as well. I think we're going to invite one more round, and I'm going to ask my friend Amin to moderate that part.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Basil Kagado. I am the Program Director of the National Agenda for the Future in Syria in the UN ESCWAP. I agree with you that probably the best solution to the Syria refugee issue is to exert high political effort on the parties to end once and for all with. But however, we don't want to focus on improving the resilience of the host communities without really thinking of the resilience of Syrians inside Syria. There's a lot of Syrians who take on refuge because of humanitarian reasons, and not only because of humanitarian reasons, but also because of economic reasons. So probably we need to have the courage as well to move beyond some taboos and try to start to think of really helping development inside Syria, even though inside territories that are considered now in a conflict area.
Madam, please.
Hi, my name is Virginia Villar, and I'm working for UNRWA as Chief of External Relations. In fact, my colleague just mentioned one of the things that I wanted to mention is that the panel has consistently and very comprehensively explained how should we support the host communities and the people who are moving because of the conflict. And indeed, I just wanted to add that and to plea that we also focus and we don't forget that the people who have not yet moved and that who are living in Syria. And I think to the conflict, and it is the moment when the lack of hope for a political process and the conflict comes hand in hand with the lack of economic opportunities and the lack of basic services, that people really start moving. This is what we see with Palestine refugees, and they involve us in those decisions. So it's those two aspects that move people to leave. And they are apart from other actors. We can do things in Syria. We can still do. UNRWA provides education, health, social services. We also provide microfinance that was mentioned, out of which most of the beneficiaries, 95% of the beneficiaries, are Syrians. And I think it's also about pushing for access so that we can still work, we and others can work still in Syria and continue providing support. Another point is that whenever we provide support for host communities, we also don't forget the most vulnerable. Sometimes, and I agree with both, it was Annabella and Karsten that mentioned the need to convalidate, to accept the certificates for professional education and things like this. Let's also not forget the most vulnerable. I mean, some Palestine refugees and about others do not even have the possibility of registering birth. So, not even let's go to something else. So whenever we support also the host communities, let's also talk to them so that the most basic rights my colleague also mentioned, are taken care of. And the last point I was going to make was the point that Sumi made, is that at the end the only thing that will make a difference is that we all, apart from working to provide support to the victims and to support the host communities, to help, that we all push at the same time for a political solution, and that there is a real political process with genuine efforts. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we are coming to an end of this session. It's already beyond time. I think, from my perspective, this is a very good way to end the session and I thank the colleagues from ESCOA and from UNRWA bringing assistance inside Syria, be it resilience or livelihood or access to services and otherwise, because indeed the movement out of Syria is not only because of security, but the combination of course, and sometimes more often maybe the latter, the livelihood and the access to services or the lack of services that prompted Syrians to leave. And I think there is, in tomorrow's high-level panels, there is a panel that is chaired by Ms. Helen Clark on assistance and resilience basically inside Syria, and there are people who are working in Syria proper as far as development, resilience and other. And I think there we have to find not innovative approaches, but as our colleague mentioned, is to go beyond the taboo, because it's not helping the Syrians nor the international community, nor the donors, nor the humanitarian actors if we really mix the politics with assistance. And this is a taboo I think you meant. I think we have to be bold. Time is going fast, sticking, and I think it's time to stabilize the population. It's in everybody's interest, be it in the region or far abroad, to keep people in their homes and provide them with services and livelihood that they need. I think also, looking at that, one cannot skip the fact that there is a move towards the peace settlement. There is a progress in the sense that the table is balanced with all actors that have a stake in this conflict, be it the Gulf, be it the Iranians, and now the Russians are in the lead, both tracks in the right, in the political and the military, and all the West on the other hand. So I think, and it is in everybody's interest now, not only for the sake of the Syrians, only for the neighboring countries, that this conflict ends and ends soon. And I hope that there will be a political will to end it. Maybe I'll pass to you, Zumi, to give your last words.
Okay, thank you. Yes, just on that, we fully agree, and I think we are all actually shifting our approaches. We want to do more within Syria, inside Syria. We of course believe that people should have a right, have the right to seek asylum. If there is a security concerns, etc., then of course people have the right to seek asylum and seek protection. But if people are leaving for other reasons, then those reasons will need to be addressed and can be addressed when we can work. And that, from that perspective, at least from UNDP's perspectives, our direction is that we would definitely like to do more, and we do have a program that we have prepared, and we are definitely looking at some of those issues like basic services, etc. Now, let me just summarize some of the key points that emerged from this session. I think we all agree that this is definitely an unprecedented crisis that we are all tackling, and therefore our approaches will need to be different. No business as usual type of approach will, in fact, be able to tackle the massive challenges that are. We are collectively, including the host communities, host governments, but also the international community as well. So we need to shift our paradigms. We need to do things differently. Some of the keywords that emerged from this session is that we really should be focusing at the local level. Keyword, again, we don't have to emphasize, resilience building. But let's work at the local level. Let's support the government. And let's work with local organizations, national and local organizations that are in fact on the front line, if you will, in terms of supporting those refugees and displaced persons. We also heard by many of you and then also all the panelists that we need to actually shift our approach from on an annual basis humanitarian response to longer-term response with the view to having more sustainable responses. We probably cannot have an illusion that this crisis will end anytime soon, and therefore we need to have longer-term planning. This will require probably that the humanitarians and the development planning cycles and programming cycles will need to be harmonized and aligned. Just like we came up with this 3RP, we need to integrate our humanitarian and development approaches further. And that's where we are, in fact, heading towards. The third thing I think we heard also from the panelists as well as all of you is that we need to bring additional incentive, additional financial measures to support the host governments. Small-scale programs and projects would not actually cut it. We need much more so that, for example, this particular country, Jordan, can actually move towards tapping into the capacities and resources that the refugee population can offer. But for the host governments to tap into that, they're going to need some additional support, both in terms of budget support, but also investments, etc. So I think this is also a new element of the response, if you will, the paradigm shift from the ordinary, normal sort of refugee support mechanism to something new, a new business model that we are also beginning to discuss in the context of the World Humanitarian Summit. I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much, and I apologize for those who wanted to speak and intervene from the floor. We just simply ran out of time, but perhaps we could continue this discussion later on at the reception. Thank you very much.